Hello, this is your host, Eric Hacopian of PoliTalks, and we are honored to be joined by Irina Ghaplanyan, who is the first Deputy Minister of Nature Protections. Ms. Ghaplanyan earned a PhD from Cambridge University in Politics and International Studies. She's a former lecturer at AUA and a noticed environmentalist and restaurateur. Ms. Ghaplanyan, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start off with a big picture, a big issue, which I don't think is discussed enough, given the host of problems, even environmental problems that Armenia has, and that is the issue of global warming, which is obviously, when it comes to international environmental issues, the number one issue on the planet. What is the impact of global warming changes right now on Armenia, and what are those expected changes over the next 20 or 30 years?
Thank you for the question. I was actually hoping you will ask me this because, again, as you mentioned, this is not talked about enough, whereas we need to speak about it loudly given that Armenia is very vulnerable to climate change. And if in the framework of the UNFCCC and IPCC report, we know that we...
Can you explain what IPCC is?
Sure. IPCC is it's international undertaking doing a major scientific analysis of global warming and climate change. And they have recently released a report in October stating that we're running out of time in taking necessary measures to curb climate change. And with the United Nations Convention for Climate Change major undertaking in 2015, when the countries came together to sign the Paris Accord, the intention was to curb the increase at 2 degrees Celsius, whereas the recent IPCC report said that we need to work towards 1.5 goal. Given the changes we have already been seeing throughout the world in terms of different weather patterns that have been very unusual. So with that in mind, when we talk about 1.5 degree level that we need to prevent reaching, Armenia has already registered a 1.23 degrees Celsius increase from the early 20s, from the early 20th century, early 1920s, when we were taking the record of temperatures in the country. And with that, we have already registered a 9% decrease in precipitation. So Armenia is already experiencing the impact of climate change as we speak. And with that, we're already seeing a depletion of vital eco-resources of this country. So it is no surprise that in 2010 already World Bank identified, they used specific methodology through which they identify the vulnerability of given countries to climate change. And in our region, World Bank has ranked Armenia as 4th most vulnerable country to climate change. With all of that in mind, we as a country need to take very drastic measures in preparing and adapting to climate change. And that requires significant investment into our infrastructure, significant investment into proper management of our resources.
Well, I mean, I think this sort of leads to the second question, which is the issue of water policy. Because I don't know if many people don't know this, but per capita, Armenia is one of the richest water countries in the world, actually. So it's like the water, as we know, is likely to be the resource of the 21st century, when carbon fuels was the resource of the 20th century. But a lot isn't known about who owns the water rights in Armenia, and how are they managed. And lastly, what can be done to take advantage of the fact that you have per capita water-rich countries surrounded by countries that are going to be even more dramatically impacted by climate change and are likely to be needing that water or will be willing to purchase it?
So Armenia, as you mentioned, one of the most valuable resources that are currently in the planet and is projected to increase in its value is water, and Armenia has abundance of it, both underground and surface waters. And The problem is, though, that we have, well, the advantage is that we have a lot more, that there's a lot more supply than demand. However, we register every year, year in and year out, we register massive losses of water because of very poor management. And because of that, we go to very drastic measures, such as tackling with Lake Sevan and having to drop the level of Lake Sevan and use the water.
Now, poor management, do you mean by poor management a poor infrastructure or a poor management structure of using the water? Which one are you talking about?
All of it.
Okay.
And that spans agriculture, that spans the infrastructure, that spans also the habits of our people, of our citizens. Because of historic abundance of this resource, we let the water run without understanding how valuable this resource is. So from the need to work towards in the direction of changing the behavior of the consumer about what water is and how valuable it is, to completely restructuring the infrastructure legislation, very importantly, but also working with private sector, because there was very poor water management with fisheries, with agricultural irrigation. So there has to be a complex approach, and it's not just our ministry that's in charge. There are other respective state agencies that are working in that direction. And we need to undertake systemic approach, from reforming the legislation to doing field work.
Now, I asked specifically about the ownership of the waters. I mean, who owns the water rights to the country? Is it under state? Is it owned by the state? Has it been privatized? Is it owned like in the mining sector, where things are owned by people that nobody can even identify? To what extent was the water resources of the country privatized, and to what extent are they still owned by the state?
So our ministry is tasked with the function of issuing the so-called water permits to different private entities who want to use that water. And the entire water resource system is divided between different agencies. So, for example, there's Water Committee, which is under the Ministry of Energy. There's also we have an agency within our ministry that actually is responsible for issuing the water permits. The problem, though, is that because the lax legislation, because of many problems and loopholes in the legislation, there has been very high level of corruption in particularly issuance of water permits. And we have seen that particularly, and media covered this extensively with fish farms, and how abhorrently they used water. And if you do very basic calculations, how expensive it is to actually produce 1 kilogram of fish from a fish farm, yet you don't see that calculation put in place if you obviously properly use water resources.
Well, let's talk about illegal logging. Since 1991 and the energy crisis that ensued after the blockade of Armenia, the forests of this country have been under attack in so many ways, and that has continued, even though the worst of the energy crisis passed. I remember being in Dilijan, staying overnight, and you couldn't sleep because you hear the illegal logging going on all night, and no one was willing to do anything about it or even talk about it. What steps has your government taken to fight illegal logging and the people who profit from it?
So there are a number of complexities to illegal logging, and that comes, when previous administrations like to talk about, well, there's need for wood. In reality, that's not the case. In reality, when you look at the level of gasification, for example, of Armenia, it's 94 plus. Armenia is gasified, actually one of the most gasified countries in the world, meaning the infrastructure of natural gas for heating. Again, of course, it still is expensive for the population, but infrastructure is there. previous administrations often talked about, there's need because of socioeconomic problems, the poverty, et cetera, et cetera. But what data shows really is that illegal logging happens not so much because of socioeconomic problems, but because of the commercial aspect of it. So, and another complexity of it is that previously, because there was a lot of money to make, a lot of entities were part of these operations. So in order to curb this, the government has undertaken a number of initiatives. First of all, strengthening legislation in this respect, strengthening the infrastructure, the state infrastructure, the agencies that work, coordinating and improving the activities of the agencies that are in charge of preventing this. But also working with the population and ensuring that they also serve as important points for data gathering and information. And of course, there were a number of arrests, and other state agencies were in place to communicate very important message that the forests are ours. And it's interesting that we also need to see a behavioral change there, where communities conceive the notion and the understanding that forests are belong to all of us, and we all breathe fresher air if there are more of them. So in that respect, again, there's a whole spectrum of undertakings that the government is working on, from change of behavior of the population to infrastructural changes and, of course, legislative changes.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you brought up what happened with the previous regime, because I remember during the elections, Edward Shah-Nazarov had an ad. He was one of the spokesmen for the Republican Party at the border of Tavush, Mars, and he was saying because illegal logging is being clamped down upon, the price of wood products for burning has gone up, which obviously leads you to the obvious question that what were you doing for 25 years that in the 21st century people need to burn wood to heat their homes. But leaving that aside, you need to look at the alternatives to that. There are still, even with the gasification, a class of people who cannot afford to use the gasification that has been provided. But we know for a fact that there are actually alternatives. The briquette model, that's actually it's a biofuel source that's actually cheaper and even more burns more efficiently than firewood. And those are tremendous industries to support and promote. What is your department doing for the person who actually cannot afford to use the gas products that are available? What are you doing to promote those kind of industries, if anything?
Certainly. So first of all, that environment is the number one target and suffers the most when you have poverty, because people start to consume unsustainably the resources that they're surrounded with. So for us, it's a priority, because any environmental change undertaking reform has to go hand in hand with socioeconomic reforms. So in that respect, we're working with a lot of development partners to ensure that there's a supply of briquettes to these communities that are particularly impacted by socioeconomic problems. But also there's this concept of natural fall from the trees, and and it was also previously mismanaged and misused. So this natural fall from the trees is collected by rangers, by the employees of the respective state agencies, and then distributed to those communities. And of course, in a larger scheme of things, the government is working on the development of alternative sources of energy, such as solar, for example. And Armenia has a tremendous potential of growth in that respect. And the first beneficiaries certainly will be and are the rural communities that can become so-called prosumers. They're not just consumers of energy, but they also produce and give it back to the grid.
Well, I mean, when you look at renewables, I was reading today, and this, Morocco, which is obviously not a very wealthy country, they get 35% of their electricity from renewables. What is your administration's program specifically in promoting renewables? Is it tax credits? and in what fields, in what areas, how easy it is for people to get into? Are you looking at bringing in foreign investors? What's your program on kicking up this green economy that the country needs?
Absolutely. Well, the major breakthrough was actually last year when a big foreign company came in and made a very good proposal, which was a very strong impetus to the solar market of Armenia. They proposed a rate which is very competitive, not just in Armenia but on a global scale, and that gave birth to Maastricht 1, which is currently being built, solar. So Maastricht 1 is being built with a solar power potential of 55 megawatts. And currently the renewables stand at a third of Armenia's energy structure, but the goal is very ambitious, but actually quite doable. And in the recent Energy Week that took place in November of last year, Ministry of Energy presented a very ambitious plan of bringing the renewables to a 50% share in the energy structure of Armenia in the next 5 years. And as insanely ambitious as it sounds, we have all the preconditions for it to happen, given also the global market trends of the decreasing price of solar panels, of the competitiveness because of that, the competitiveness of solar energy on the market. So Armenia has very good preconditions to seriously develop that market, and the Ministry of Energy has put forward a very ambitious plan for it.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to ask one last question, which isn't related to the specific topic, and I'm going to keep asking this question until we see change. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we had this fantastic report about the number of women in the tech sector, where Armenia is the #1 country. I think it was over 35% of people in the tech sector are women, which is the highest number in the world. So we have Armenian women who are outperforming every other group of women in the world in the most competitive industry in the world. And when we look at the cabinet of the current administration, we have only 1 woman out of 12. What can we do to change that? And is that something that should be acceptable?
Certainly it shouldn't be acceptable. And collectively we can do a lot. First of all, we need to start empowering women and pushing them to make that step, because culturally and socially we've conditioned women to value themselves less than their male counterparts. And this social and cultural conditioning has led to women doing the back office work and never taking the credit for the work that was done. So in that respect, it's a collective major undertaking and effort on the part of each and every one of us collectively as a society, and of course of the administration, to push forward women and remove the glass ceilings and glass walls that really do exist, and we need to talk more about it and create the right conditions for women to take decision-making positions.
Well, I'm glad we shared that opinion. Ms. Ghaplanyan, it's been a pleasure having you on our show, and we'll look forward to having you back.
Thank you. Thank you.